Hey everyone, and welcome to In Real Life. I'm Jasmine.
And I'm Cutter.
And today we're going to be talking to Michael Showalter, who is the director of In the Eyes of Tammy, Faye.
Michael, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So let's just jump in. Why this story and why right now?
So for me, as a director, I just am always looking for material that's interesting to me, and that has elements about it that make me excited to try to tell the story and show that world. And I just thought, first of all, just working, I knew Jessica Chastain was a part of it before I ever was, and I was excited to work with her, and to the idea of her playing this character I thought was really interesting and surprising, and could be really fun and but I also just think as a story to tell, there's a lot there. It's about spirituality and the intersection between spirituality and politics and money. There's greed and power and relationships, and so there's really so many reasons. The culture, the media, the way in which Tammy was portrayed in the media, and perhaps unfairly portrayed in the media, sort of for the way she looked. In a lot of respects, it was, people didn't like the way she looked, they didn't like the way she sounded, and so we wanted to kind of judge her for that. And the more you look at it, the more interesting layers there are there. And so there were just so many things about this that I was excited about. And also just the simple fact of that it's entertaining. They were entertaining. They were fun to watch. The costumes, the hair, the songs, the way they talk. It's an interesting, strange world that I was excited to go into and recreate.
Yeah, I found it personally a pretty sincere depiction of it all, of Tammy Faye, of everyone in her orbit. And as I was thinking of it, I was trying to ask myself, is this a sincere depiction of a sincere woman, a sincere depiction of an insincere woman, or an insincere, so forth and so on? Or then I stopped and I go, do those categories even apply? As you were thinking through like how to tell a sincere portrait of someone who really was, we got different takes from the media and from other, sources. How did you think about your role as the sort of storyteller in terms of trying to offer that sort of sincere portrait of this woman and everything going on in her life?
I'm probably not, I'm going to answer your question a little potentially indirectly by saying I have heard some people say that they think the movie in the beginning, there's this sense of like, are we making fun of them? And a lot of times that's what you'll hear in terms of your idea of that, the sort of sincerity, like what's the take? Mm-hmm. And I've heard this said is like, in the beginning, I thought you were making fun of them, or are they making fun of them? And what I think is that that nothing changes in actual. So then you realize, oh, well, they're not making fun of them. Mm-hmm. But in actuality, nothing changes in the way we told the story from the beginning to the end. It's that I think you as an audience member get used to them as characters, because what it is that makes you maybe think we're making fun of them is how they talk. Hmm. And it seems like we might be making fun of them because who talks like that? Hmm. And so the idea is like, oh, we're making fun of how they talk by having them just talk the way they talk. Mm. And I credit Jessica and Andrew in being really committed to talking the way these characters talk, which has to do with, I'll just say for myself, the way in which religious terminology is incorporated into their speech is very strange to most people. Well, God said, well, I was walking down the street and God said, blah, 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 blah. And you're like, who does that? Who says that? Like, well, God said to me, he said, and they're very that can seem that way of talking can seem very alienating or very strange. But I think all of us tried to treat that with sincerity and to try to understand what that is and how that manifested in these people who in many ways are not that different than the rest of us, but like anybody else have their own way of communicating and their own life experience that created them. In a different time, I think Tammy might have, chosen a different path. Maybe she, because in a lot of ways, both of them just liked being performers. They like to perform. They like to.
Well, most of our audience of people that we talk to are actually religious folks in the sort of Christian subculture. So to me, it came off very real to life in terms of how.
So what I'm saying isn't right. Exactly. Well, that's for me. It was something I had to acclimate to.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately it became normal to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you did a great job at humanizing both the characters as well as evangelical prosperity gospel in general. But what did you consider to be your primary source material? Was it the documentary on her, or was it based on just historical facts and research?
Both. Definitely, watched the documentary and found all of that really interesting. But also, she wrote a bunch of books. Tammy herself wrote a bunch of books. Jim has a bunch of books. There's a bunch out there that's written about it from other people. There's a ton of material out there from all different angles talking about what happened, who they were, what their story was. Whether it's, Jim has an autobiography that he wrote. Tammy has multiple autobiographies that she wrote. The guy from Charlotte, the Charlotte newspaper, he wrote a book about it. And we read all of that and looked at all of that, as well as there was a lot of just footage that we got from the guys that made the documentary that was just archival footage of their show and PTL and all of that stuff. So we tried to read all of it and take all of it into consideration.
Speaking of sort of that historical take, I think I heard a radio ad or something that described the film as sort of the rise, fall, and redemption of Tammy Faye Bakker. So as sort of a storyteller, thinking about that arc, I wonder what you make of that, because I sense something similar, but then you get to that sort of last scene, and she's singing, the battle hymn of the Republic, and sort of has these visions of what's taking place there. And I think part of my question was, especially given where we're at now, kind of historically, with the kind of marriage of sort of right-wing republicanism, nationalism, and Christian subcultures. My question was, redeemed into what? And so I wonder if you could reflect on that a little bit, of what that means for her as a character and what you were trying to do there as the storyteller.
So I'll tell you what it is for me, but it could be different for Jessica, and it could be different. And I think all of this stuff is open to interpretation.
Yeah.
So I'll just tell you what it is for me. I think that one of the problems that Tammy is having is this collision with Jerry Falwell's version of what Christianity is.
Mm-hmm.
And that she has a slightly different version than he does. More than slightly. She has a very different version than he does. Mm-hmm. But both have to do with whether land you at, are you a good Christian or not? And what happens is that she's cast out of the community that she helped to build. And so she has a crisis of faith where she is afraid or feeling that she's lost her contact with God. Mm-hmm. That she has lost her connection to God. Mm-hmm. And what she realizes, and in that very last scene, she's afraid that those people who are the same people that have exiled her, because she's afraid, oh, they're not going to like me, they don't want to see me. That audience is the same people that were her television audience that have exiled her from that. She's an outcast, and she's afraid they won't accept her back. What she realizes in that scene is that it doesn't matter, that her faith is inside of her, and that people are, that she is or isn't accepted by this group of people, but that God, quote unquote, whatever you want to call it, is something that she has with her. It doesn't matter what you think, what they think of her. So that's the redemption to me, is that she finds her faith. And it's not about whether or not people like her or don't like her, or accept her or don't accept her. It's something much more personal to her.
So in real life, what's the deeper conversation that you're hoping to bring viewers into with this film?
I think there's so many conversations that could be had. I mean, there's how we treat people in the media, how we rush to judgment, the intersection between faith and spirituality and politics, and whether or not that's a good thing, and how that's created divisions where or spirituality and faith and the pursuit of the accumulation of power and money is something to talk about. But there's also just celebrating this woman and the life that she lived, and I think to sense that we did potentially misjudge her. And so by proxy, where else can you look in your life and the world around you and say, where else am I judging a book by its cover and not going deeper?
Well, we really want to celebrate your film and are thankful for you making it. And I'm really hopeful that it'll spark some good conversation, specifically in the group of folks that we work with and interact with. I think those are all conversations we desperately need to have, given where we're at right now as a society, and then also as people that identify as Christians in the world. So thank you very much for your film, and thank you for taking time to talk to us today.
Thank you so much, guys. Appreciate it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Blessings.
Take care.
Well, that was a really fun conversation, and it's always interesting to hear from creatives when they're thinking about their art, when and where they came into the project and how they understand it, interpret it. And I actually appreciated that Michael was willing to kind of offer an interpretation of his film. A lot of times they won't. They'll say,
Right.
But probably for me, the most interesting point that he raised was how odd he and most of us, as he said, find Christian people, specifically evangelicals, and the way they talk, and the way they infuse God in like their everyday language, and how like foreign and maybe alien that seems. All the while, me and Jasmine are sitting here going like, "Oh, that's how most of the people we know talk." Yeah. And so to me, it was a really important point, because as people of faith engaging film or culture or media, this really is a great sort of missional opportunity, especially when artists and filmmakers are demonstrating enough care and concern to actually tell a story and attempt to tell a sincere story about people they really don't understand. And so part of, at least the reason I'm involved in talking to filmmakers and artists in Hollywood, is to try to make what is strange to them familiar, right? And try to sort of bridge that gap and go, I know we seem like really weird people and very odd, but you know what? We're just humans. And the more you get to know us, the better. So I found that really interesting. What was something you kind of took away from that combo?
Well, even with that, I think, so do you think that he did a good job at making Christianity and the way we do like walk through life with his faith normal? Like, or would somebody who doesn't, share this faith still walk away from it saying, see, I told you they were weird?
No, I think you're right. So to one degree, yes. So I mention this all the time. Like if you really step back from it, so let's imagine you were raised in a Christian church. Some of the practices we do, like communion. So we all get together every week and we consume the flesh and blood of the God who became a human 2,000 years ago. Okay, so on the face of it,
right,
that's weird, right?
We would think it was weird if we were hearing about it and weren't part of it.
And that's good, actually. There's a kind of oddity or peculiarity that that I think we always need to kind of embrace. And so in that sense, I think you're right. Even the most sincere portrayal to many people who are outsiders to that are going to look at it and go like, oh, okay, that really is them. The question I think for us is, when it comes to our peculiarities, what are the things that are really peculiar because they align with the sort of peculiarity and the scandal of God? And what is it that we've kind of created that it's just weird and it's culture wars and it's stuff that has nothing to do with what God's up to in the world, but instead is us just being sort of like weird for the sake of being weird. And I think that's the struggle for me, especially when that weirdness is clearly sort of hypocritical, like the things you're doing are clearly at odds with what you claim to be about. I think that's the other kind of oddity that a lot of the broader folks who are in our society think and ask questions about Christians, to go, well, it's one, you can be weird and you can talk weird, but it's weird that you say this, but then you do that.
Well, yeah. So this is something that stuck out to me, right? You said like culture wars and things that are weird that just don't seem like they align with Jesus's message. Race, right? Like, so I kept wondering while I was watching, is this when we saw sprinkles of Black people, were they Hollywood tokens, like, okay, gotta check all the boxes, we need to throw a Black person into the pool party, and then we need to throw some sprinkles of Black people into the audience of the 700 Club? So were those Hollywood sprinkles, or were they are they evangelical tokens? Like, did they exist at that time? Is that an accurate portrayal? I feel like we know that there are certainly Black Christians who were part of that movement, but is it accurate that they would have been invited to those parties, those very intimate parties, or be in the audience?
So from your perspective, what's sort of the ideal? So let's imagine the reality is, no, Black persons were not present at those pool parties. Would you prefer to see a film that reflected that? Or would you prefer to see a film that somehow did something else so that at least the representation of Black people who are Christians is even in this film, which might be historically accurate, but he talked about media messages, might help us think a little differently.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I would prefer the portrayal to be accurate, but alongside that accuracy, visual accuracy, I would prefer that it would somehow be addressed. You know how like politics was like a blip in there. It wasn't like a larger conversation, but they didn't cut that scene with Jerry Falwell where they talked about Reagan and they added, that 2-minute, 3-minute scene about politics. Well, in the same way, there must have been some conversations around maybe not. I mean, just if there could have been a blip on, the separation, or the place that Black people don't have, or how Black people can be used as tools in, in their own churches, or I don't know how they would have done that. So maybe that's a reach, but understanding that, I think being able to see that, present it more accurately without totally dismissing it, right? Like, I don't want to see like that people aren't there and then it's never just, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think what you're getting is self-aware. So, right, that as long as the film, any film, not this one even in particular, is self-aware enough to go, okay, if we're going to show a very white world, we want to be aware, the film's aware of the consequences of that when it happens. I mean, you could have, for example, done something with the politics, because again, in that sort of era, there was intentional strategies deployed for how are we going to engage or not Black Americans.
Well, and Reagan.
Yes, exactly. So so that was in play, and that didn't come up. So I think simple things like that you're kind of getting at least acknowledge what was going on, and that would have made a really extra additional layer that would have been really interesting in the movie.
Right, because they acknowledge, you know, sort of the male-centered dominance, right? Like when you see Tammy try to fit into that world, they acknowledge the politics, they acknowledge sexuality. So it's not like he's not like hitting on several of these big issues, but that issue, not that he has to cover every issue in one film, right? Issues. Like he's not responsible for all of that, but that's something that I noticed as a Black viewer, actress, person.
Well, fascinating film. As Michael said, it brings up, I think, a ton of different questions for us as people who identify as Christians, for people who are part of the evangelical subculture, whether we're still in that subculture or we've left it or it's been formative or shaping our lives. I find this movie really interesting for that. And then on top of it, that it was created by a bunch of people who are not that. That we have, you know, major studios and major Hollywood folks saying, we really find this an important and compelling story for good and for ill, right? And so I just think it's a really important opportunity for us to both be self-reflective, but then think through like, how might this be a moment that we can reach out, we can build bridges to people who really sometimes look at us as pretty bizarre folks. So Jasmine, as always, thank you for being with me on the journey. And thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next time.
Bye.